The transit lounge at Veth Sector Waypoint 11 was a large, cold room that smelled like recirculated air and alien ambition. Everything in it was built for the Veth. The benches were too tall, the lighting ran in a spectrum that bleached human skin to the color of old paper, and the climate sat at a temperature that I understood was comfortable for scaled bodies but felt, to me, like the inside of a walk-in cooler someone had forgotten to stock. I'd been sitting there for 4 hours. I didn't mind. I had tea in a thermos, a transit manifest that needed reading, and Chester. Chester was 11 years old, which is old for a beagle. His muzzle had gone gray 3 years ago and hadn't stopped. His ears were longer than they should have been, which had been true since he was a puppy, and his eyes were the color of old amber, and when he slept, he breathed with the slow, deliberate certainty of something that had already decided the universe was acceptable and chose to remain in it. He was sleeping now, across my boots, which were standard-issue civilian logistics. His rib cage rose and fell. That was everything Chester was doing, and it was enough. I was retired. 41 years in the Inter-Coalition Logistics Corps, the last 9 of which Chester had been with me. I was nobody now. My pass said civilian transit, Category D. I had a berth on the outbound hauler and a sister on Karath Station who made good food and asked better questions, and that was what I was going toward. Nothing about me or Chester was remarkable in that room, to anyone who knew how to read things correctly. The Veth Warlord commanding Sector 11 didn't know how to read things correctly. I noticed him when he arrived, because the entire room reconfigured itself around his entrance. The Veth are a tall people, 4 arms, bilateral torso plating the color of hammered iron, heads that sit forward on their necks, like they are always already accusing you of something. This one had the particular stillness of a body accustomed to having an entourage, which he did. 6 armored subordinates and a civilian aide in pale robes, who moved slightly behind and to his left, holding a datapad she was consulting, rather than looking at the room. He took a position at the far end of the lounge near the priority embarkation gate. His entourage arranged themselves. Several other passengers, 2 Keth scholars, a Moran family, a pair of Veth civilians who looked immediately uncomfortable, contracted slightly, and found reasons to face the walls. I kept reading my manifest. Chester kept sleeping. The aide noticed Chester first. She was scanning the room, as aides do, cataloging threats and irrelevancies, and her eyes moved to Chester and stopped. I noticed her pause, because I have spent 4 decades noticing things that other people file in the wrong drawer. She looked at Chester for perhaps 3 full seconds. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at her datapad, and her chin lowered slightly, and she said something I couldn't hear to the Warlord, in a register too quiet for my translator to catch. The Warlord looked at Chester. Chester breathed. What happened next was, I think, the Warlord's error, and I think he made it because he was bored. It is possible to be very powerful and very bored at the same time, and the combination produces a specific kind of judgment that mistakes comfort for wisdom. He said, loudly enough for the room to hear in the Veth common dialect, "What is that Earth parasite doing in my transit lounge?" Not a question, an observation. The kind a man makes when he's already decided the answer doesn't matter, but wants everyone nearby to know he's capable of asking. 2 of his armored subordinates separated from the entourage and walked toward me. Not fast. The walk of people who have never needed to hurry. One of them was holding what looked like a restraint pole with a loop at the end, which told me they had done just enough research to misunderstand completely. I folded the manifest. Chester opened one eye. I should say here that Chester was, as beagles go, a remarkably quiet dog. He had never been what you'd call a performer. He didn't do tricks. He didn't particularly want to. What he did was follow me through 41 years of logistics work, through 6 postings across 3 coalition sectors, through a marriage, and through what came after the marriage. And he had developed, in that time, the particular composure of something that has seen a great deal and retained the option of caring about very little of it. He looked at the 2 approaching subordinates. They were perhaps 4 meters away. Chester's eye closed. The 2 subordinates stopped. I watched this happen. I had watched things like this happen before, across 11 years, and I had never been able to explain it to anyone's full satisfaction, so I had stopped trying. What I can tell you is that it is a quality Chester has, a kind of pressure that isn't aggressive and isn't performed. and is simply there, the way the floor of a very deep ocean is simply there, and that some bodies register it immediately, and some bodies have to learn about it the hard way. These two registered it. They stood at 4 meters and did not come closer. The warlord said something sharper to them, in a dialect my translator labeled Veth Command Register, private, and declined to render. One of the subordinates answered him. The warlord's forward-leaning head tilted. He looked at Chester again. Chester had not moved. His ribcage rose and fell. That was everything Chester was doing. The aide's voice, the one that had been too quiet earlier, said something else. This time I caught 2 words from it. The first word was the Veth term for the Inter-Coalition Death World Classification Registry. The second word was the number they use for the highest tier. The warlord looked at the aide. He looked at Chester. He looked at the restraint pole his subordinate was still holding. He looked at the door. The 2 subordinates had already taken a step back. Not a retreat, just a repositioning. The kind that happens when a body decides, below the level of conscious thought, that the geometry of a situation has changed. The entourage reconvened around the warlord. He walked to the priority embarkation gate. The gate opened immediately, which it was, of course, designed to do for him, and he and his 6 subordinates and his pale-robed aide went through it. The aide stopped at the threshold and turned around once and looked at Chester for the 3 full seconds she'd given him the first time. Then she went through. The door closed. The transit lounge settled. The Keth scholars went back to their conversation. The Miron family's smallest child pressed its face against the observation window again. The 2 Veth civilians at the wall found that they had been looking for seats this whole time, and now, having found them, sat down. I put Chester's lead back in my pocket. I hadn't taken it out. I poured the last of the thermos. Chester sighed, the long, boneless sigh of a dog who had decided, once again, that the universe was acceptable, and put his gray muzzle back on my boot. I drank my tea. 4 hours is a long time in a room that isn't built for you, but I had done longer. When you've spent 4 decades moving things from one side of the galaxy to the other, you learn that most of what matters in a given situation is already present in the room. You don't need to add to it, you just need to know what's there. Chester knew what was there. That had always been enough. The outbound hauler came on time. I gathered my pack and my manifest and Chester's travel kit, the small canvas bag with his water bowl and his food tin, and the folded travel blanket he had used for 6 years and would not accept a replacement for, and Chester stood up from his position on my boots with the slow, considered effort of an old body that has decided to get up and then done it, and we walked to the gate. The transit officer scanned my pass without looking up. She looked at Chester. She looked back at the scanner. She stamped the pass without a word, which was fine. We didn't need one. Behind us, the transit lounge continued to be a large, cold room. Somewhere in the waypoint, behind a priority embarkation door, I imagined the warlord's aide was updating a file on her datapad, adding a category, cross-referencing the classification number with the old Beagle she had spent 6 seconds studying in a transit lounge and had correctly, quietly, categorized before her employer had made his error. I don't know what she wrote. I know what Chester is. The hauler left on schedule. Chester curled on the bunk beside me and put his gray head on my knee, and I looked out the porthole at the waypoint falling away behind us, and thought about my sister's food and her better questions. Chester was asleep before we cleared the dock. He always slept well in transit. He always had.